Thank you for joining us today for this symposium. I'm TERRI Lee Freeman, President of the National Civil Rights Museum. We have been planning this symposium along with our co-host Just City for more than a year. Initially, the symposium was to be held here at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee in March 2020. Need I say more? While the term pivot is likely the most overused term since the onset of the pandemic, we did just that and have pivoted to a virtual format that I'm certain will be just as informative and engaging as the planned face-to-face event. The need for this symposium has simply grown over the past 9 months. The issues surrounding policing, prosecutions, and sentencing continue to set off alarm bells, particularly for Black and Brown people. But since February 2020, we have had the added issue of a pandemic, an unchecked, potentially lethal virus moving through our prisons without adequate precautions and protections being provided. For the next 90 minutes, we will address these civil and human rights issues. We hope to provoke your thinking on these issues and generate some ideas for how you can push for reform of the criminal justice system. So thanks again for joining us.
James Baldwin, a Black American novelist, playwright, and activist, wrote in an unfinished piece, "I'm saying that a journey is called that because you cannot know what you will discover on the journey, what you will do, what you will find, or what you find will do to you." As American people, each of us has a story of our journey to America. Some inhabited the land long before colonizers, slaves, and immigrants arrived. Some journeys have been filled with triumph, others terror. Some have been filled with hope, others heartbreak. We must learn from every story so that when similar themes of oppression and inequality appear, we recognize what they are and how we can overcome them. Journey Stop 1: Roots of an Unjust System. Panelist, Professor Megan Ming Francis, Dr. Duane Loynes, and Sarah Lockridge-Steckel. Moderated by Joia Thornton, Program and Partnership Manager with Just City.
Thank you, panelists, for joining us today. I am Joia Erin Thornton, policy organizer and criminal justice reform advocate right here in Memphis. I'm also the program and partnership manager at Just City. This year has been rough, and it's evoked an ample amount of emotions for every last one of us. Several correlations from 1918 and 1919, the Spanish flu, were drawn to help people understand exactly what happened from the past and how people from the past managed their lives and sustained their well-being during a pandemic year. Unpacking the root of any problem is vital to build a path toward freedom, justice, and equality. Let's begin the conference with a discussion on returning to the root of why so many people are just simply frustrated with our criminal justice system. So let's dive right in, and Professor Ming, I'm going to start with you. The first question is, what makes a system unjust, unreliable, and unfair?
Oh my goodness. So many things. First off, though, I really want to thank you and everybody that's part of the National Civil Rights Museum in Just City for holding us all together online because we cannot be gathered physically together. So what we do know, and one of the things I'm so excited about, one of the reasons why I'm so excited about being a part of this panel is because it's one that really focuses on the roots and the history and makes it very clear that in order to understand the present circumstance and the problems means to understand the deeper roots of it. So we know that over the course in terms of 2020, for 3 straight months during the spring and summer of 2020, thousands of protests and rebellions exploded across the country. More than 20 million people of all races, from large cities to rural locales, have marched and protested in a defiant display of public mourning and righteous rage, demanding accountability for the brazen murder of countless Black people at the hands of law enforcement. Their voices, their bodies, and their imaginations have awakened a sleepy nation to the crisis of democracy and the urgency of addressing deeply entrenched racial injustice. However, as historic as these protests have been, the issues that were highlighted in 2020 are not completely new. The private murder of Breonna Taylor in her home while she was sleeping and the public spectacle murder of George Floyd are not aberrations from a normal functioning criminal punishment system. A central component to the Black freedom struggle has been centered on the protection of Black lives from vigilante and state violence. And so oftentimes in terms of my work, I think in order to understand what has happened in 2020 and what is continuing to happen in 2021 means to understand the longer struggle of Black people around the protection of Black lives. And so that means that we need to actually go back to the end of the 19th century and focus on Ida B. Wells in Memphis, Tennessee, and then her move to New York, in which she is highlighting the issue of the lynching of Black people, not just in the South, but across the country, and the zero consequences that the perpetrators of lynching actually face. That struggle or that torch is then picked up by the NAACP in the beginning of the 20th century. Many people know the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, today, but that is an organization that gets its start around the issue of lynching and mob violence. They really see that as the first civil rights issue, that before Black people could go to school, vote, live in segregated neighborhoods, that they actually first had to live. And so what we're seeing here in terms of people, I know many Americans in 2020 were like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that this is happening. But this is not just in terms of new anger, right? That this is a pattern that has persisted over time in American society and has been given oftentimes kind of a wink and a nod through the politicians and the criminal punishment system. However, even though I've taken you just very quickly to the end of the 19th with Ida B. Wells and the NAACP at the beginning of the 20th, really in terms of to understand so much of the deeper problems and why small fixes will not solve deeper problems means to understand, especially in terms of what happens at the end of the Civil War all across the South, is that most of the states in the South rewrite new criminal laws that are specifically focused on capturing in terms of, and then incarcerating Black people. And then police are focused on discriminatory policing. And in many, many Southern states, you have the incarcerated population expanding from a very small percentage of Black people, because during the period of enslavement, most Black people were punished on plantations. And then you have, in terms of after emancipation, you have these incarcerated populations being over 90% Black. And then you have private companies, not just in the South, but companies in the North as well, then partnering with states for the full use of the state's convicts. One of the companies that I focus on in my research is the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company that got the entire lease of Tennessee's convicts as well as Alabama's convicts. And so when to understand, I think, the deeper problems around the criminal punishment system means to understand the deeper legacy, one, around how states actually change criminal law and racially in a racialized manner, and then also on vigilante violence as well as sanctioned violence through the criminal punishment system. And the last thing I'm going to say on this is that I think that oftentimes today people want to figure out how to repair, or not how to repair, just how to fix it, how to get these people out of the streets. And in order, it's not going to be just small fixes and or sanctioning one police officer and or changing one small law, right? It means understanding the deeper history about how things have gone so bad. And then actually doing something about it. So I'm just really excited about a panel that focuses on the roots. Thanks so much.
Wow, this is not new rage. This is not new rage, and it won't be a Band-Aid to be placed over it to fix what so many people have been dealing with. This is a generational rage. This is ancestral rage. And thank you so much for lifting up Mother Ida. We definitely revere her. in Memphis, Tennessee. I often feel that she compels me to do a lot of the work that I've been able to do both locally and nationally. So thank you so much, Professor Ming, for that response. I'm going to move right along to Professor Loynes. What can the movement for Black Lives learn from preceding activists, academics, and organizers?
Yes, thank you for that question. Good afternoon, everyone. First, I want to thank the National Civil Rights Museum in Just City for sponsoring this important symposium, and I'd also like to thank my fellow panelists and moderator. It's a privilege to be serving with all of you.
Thank you.
So what can the movement for Black Lives learn from preceding activists, academics, and organizers? Without presuming to impose my academic perspective on those people who are in the trenches doing the hard work in the movement for Black Lives, I think there are several things that can be learned. First, I'm currently working my way through Barbara Ransby's excellent biography, Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Movement. And as I read through it, I am awestruck by how the blueprint for Black Lives Matter and a lot of other organizations was articulated decades ago by this amazing Black woman. Baker's model of leadership favored a more organic grassroots model instead of the top-down, clergy-led, overwhelmingly male, hierarchical model of the mainstream civil rights movement. She believed in cultivating local leadership that was less tied to establishment structures. And we know, it's well known, that Baker was extremely critical of the hero worship given to Martin Luther King Jr. and the perils that brought to a movement for racial justice. And I think we're seeing that. I think we're learning that lesson. Here in Memphis, for example, we don't talk much about national leaders or look to them to come to Memphis to help us with our problems. Rather, we talk about the people who are here doing the work. So we talk about Shay Jones, we talk about Tammy Sawyer and Theron Bond and Earl Fisher and Andre Johnson and Keedron Franklin and my colleague Chuck McKinney and so many others who are already in the trenches doing the work. So I think the first thing that the movement for Black Lives Matter can learn, movement for Black Lives can learn from preceding activists is the power in cultivating not just local leadership, but also local strategies. Second, I think the movement can focus more on the last 2 or 3 years of King's life instead of the much celebrated first decade. Right. In the latter phase of his life, King repudiated many of his claims about race, justice, in America. In fact, toward the end of his life, King made significant connections between racial injustice, economic injustice, and the worldwide deployment of violence brought about by our military. King also got rid of his naive conception of the United States, realizing that white supremacy was more deeply embedded in the structures of American life than he had previously thought. Therefore, King, in these last 2 or 3 years, advocated not just nonviolence, but an escalated, disruptive form of nonviolence. This summer, the city of Memphis had a number of protests in response to the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and so many others. And local politicians praised many of these protests for their quiet, obedient nature, but it has to be asked if they made any difference, right? Wow. Peaceful protests tend to get co-opted by those in power. King advocated for militant and escalated nonviolence. He wanted it to be nonviolent but disruptive. King wanted us to focus less on laws that violated federal law and more on unjust conditions. He got toward the end of his life that you can have something that's legal, but it's still unjust. He wanted us to interrupt the functioning of society to highlight the unjust conditions that Black people were being subjected to. So I think the second lesson that can be learned in the movement for Black Lives is that the deeply rooted nature of white supremacy requires a response that targets our cultural demise and not just our laws. And then lastly, and this insight comes from Malcolm X, I think that the movement for Black Lives can gain much by connecting our domestic movement to similar struggles around the globe. For example, suppose I said this to you. In 2020, police apprehended an alleged criminal, murdered him in front of a crowd, and that led to widespread protests. Now, you might think I'm talking about George Floyd in May, but that description also describes what took place in Nigeria in October, shedding a light on the End SARS movement, a challenge to the Special Anti-Robbery Squad in Nigeria that's been abusing its own citizens for years. Malcolm understood that there was much to be gained from not isolating ourselves, but seeing our efforts as part of a global movement where Black and brown bodies are often targeted by law enforcement. After spending half a year abroad toward the end of his life, Malcolm contended that the mainstream civil rights movement was suffering from a lack of imagination. He wanted us to think not just about violations of civil rights, but the widespread abuse of human rights, the ways in which the basic conditions for human flourishing were denied to America's dark citizens. As an example, in a 2015 article for the Washington Post, Raha Jorjani, a defense lawyer who handles immigration cases in California, wrote the following: Black people in the United States face such racial violence that they could qualify as refugees if they didn't already live here. So, focusing on leadership and approaches that are indigenous to a community, escalating the disruptive quality of our protests, and seeing our work as part of a global movement are three lessons that I think the movement for Black lives can learn from those who came before us. Thank you.
Dr. Loynes, thank you so much for breaking that down for each and every last one of us. I really call you one of our historical gatekeepers here in Memphis. You held space and really lifted up those who are already doing the work on the ground and have been doing it for a number of years. You also mentioned people locally and internationally that we are able to learn from. I'm a deep proponent in finding your role in the movement. I definitely want to transition to Miss Sarah Lockridge-Steckel and really talk about Generation Z. Generation Z, how can Generation Z prepare for future activism work? And do they understand what's going on? Do they get it?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and for having us and for us having the opportunity to have this really rich discussion. I think when we talk about young adults, that's usually the first question I get. Do they get it? Like, what are they thinking about all this? What are they doing? And so I'm going to start with that piece of it, because I think when we really look at young adults, particularly those folks who are 18 to 23, they are experiencing all of the issues that we are talking about firsthand. And in particular, when we talk about the pandemic, so our work at the Collective Blueprint was started because we had 45,000 young adults who are out of school and out of work in our city. And we were started to address that. But that was before the pandemic. When we look at the pandemic, over 50% of young adults who are in that demographic have either lost wages or have someone in their household who has experienced a layoff. And so when we talk about all of the issues we're discussing over the course of the summer, what we've been focused on is really the intersection of those issues, because our young adults are saying, not only am I experiencing police brutality, not only am I experiencing an unjust criminal justice system, but I'm also can't feed my family, and I also don't have wages that support us, and I also have debt, and I also have no degree to show for what I've gone through. And so we're really thinking about the intersection of all of these things. And I think where Generation Z is incredibly powerful is they refuse to kind of accept what is. They're like, this is crazy. I don't understand this. I'm not sure exactly what the tactics should be. But what I do know is we're not going to stand for this, and this isn't how things are supposed to look. And, you know, in many cases, the conversations are, you know, should I even be working within this system? Because this system isn't going to work for me. It wasn't designed to work for me, and it's not going to work for me as it's currently set up. So, you know, what do I do to sort of reframe this whole thing to make it more equitable? And so I think they absolutely do get it. And I think that they are on the front lines of the protests that we are talking about. They are fighting for justice. They are trying to re-envision a system that can be different. I think Generation Z is more open to societal change, to society looking a different way than any other generation, inclusive of millennials, which I'm a millennial. And I think there is a lot of opportunity on the preparation side. So I think some of what's been discussed in terms of tactics and the history and the roots of these systems are really important, right? And looking at both, you know, in the US, but also globally, you know, South Africa was mentioned. What are the tactics that have really led to change, and what can be most effective? I think right now we have a very, diffuse, a lot of people doing a lot of different things. But how do we, use this moment in time to really organize? What does that look like? I think that Generation Z has a lot of strong perspectives around not having hierarchies, not having traditional organizational structures. But even given that, what does it look like to really respond to the injustices that we see on many fronts? Because I would say that, it's not, for them, it's the criminal justice system, it's police, it's all of this, but it's also wages, it's also education, it's also housing. And how do you have more holistic responses that address all of the systemic issues that intersect to impact people's lives? And so I think that there are a lot of intergenerational opportunities for us to come together and have some rich discussions. I think when I look at my mother's a baby boomer, her generation, she's an activist, her perspectives on things, and bringing her to the table. I often bring her in to talk with our young adults who are 18, 19, 20. And there's so much power in kind of connecting the dots, but also talking and having critical discussions about what did work, what didn't work, why didn't it work, what were some of the issues that were in the civil rights movement, what were the opportunities that came out of that. And so I think that there's real moment in time too to bring together different generations to really think about how do we do this in a way right now, in a different way right now.
No, thank you so much. And you actually said something very key, intergenerational. That's something that I'm very, very key on. And contrary to popular demand, Generation Z is 23 and down. Millennials are 24 and up, and some people get those confused. So I thank you so much for really clarifying that, and for each of you contributing to this larger issue and specific notion about how can we unpack the roots of an unjust system. There are roots within this. It just didn't start with frustration with the criminal justice system. It just didn't start with modern American policing. It actually has roots and ties to a lot of historical things that we have yet to address. Thank you, all of you, for being here on this afternoon. And we appreciate all of you for plugging into this conversation, Journey to Justice, the roots of an unjust system.
Can you please tell me what justice looks like? Because I ain't never seen it. Indictment after indictment, never a conviction. Tell me, who do you call when the murderer wears a badge? Or when the rapist comes from privilege? Somehow justice ain't just enough for us. We become fearful to leave our homes, fearful to be in a place they feel we don't belong, that crippling pain of fear, leaving a 14-year-old girl pinned under a cop's knee in a bathing suit, fearful of a jail cell with no cameras in sight, fearful to rest, to ask for help, to wear a hoodie at night, to be shot and killed in broad daylight. That fear is heavy artillery. The modernized Willie Lynch theory, make an example out of you, scare the life out of you, take the mind, keep the body strong. You see, the job is to protect and serve, not neglect and purge. And yes, heavy is the head that wears the crown. I guess that's why they're trying to take all my kings and queens down. Rapists getting off because women's lives don't seem to matter. Our sacred possessions shattered. All we wanted to do was love ourselves without blood splatter. A system that believes not only my skin color, but my gender speaks that I am less than, not worthy of justice, but I am a woman, someone's mother, someone's daughter, under the ferments of the deepest pressure, baby. I am a diamond, God's royalty, but this justice system ain't loyal to me. I am not a political slave to the political system who refuses to change unjust laws that my people's souls crave, and I will not give up. I will not cease until justice is made for you and for me. You see, I have children to teach the way. Friends who don't want to hear a thing I have to say, but that is my fight. So leave it up to me. I promise I'm the new age Nikki Giovanni, because I am not afraid to fight for what I believe. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, you know their names, so say their names. Can you please tell me what justice looks like? Because I have yet to see it. There's a war going on, and it won't be no retreating until justice is made for all.
What if the criminal justice system is not broken? What if the system is functioning the very way it was intended to shortly after the abolishment of slavery. Many Black and poor communities lack the resources to address the problems of basic needs like food, clothing, housing, and livable wages. 2020 has only highlighted these problems, with more and more people suffering from the inability to survive a major pandemic. Do the inequalities of the criminal legal system belong to the actors within the system, individuals experiencing the system, or the result of a system built to elevate one group and oppress others? Ta-Nehisi Coates says, an America that looks away is ignoring not just the sins of the past, but the sins of the present and the certain sins of the future. Looking away isn't an option, not for any of us. Every citizen, every politician, and even every company must do its part to look at the truth without flinching. And that way, together, we'll continue the fight for a more just and equitable country. Journey Stop 2, Pandemic, Policing, and Prosecution. Panelists, Professor Demetria Frank, Kevin Ring, and Professor Alex Vitale. Moderated by Josh Spickler, Executive Director of Just City.
Hey, I'm Josh Spickler. I'm the Executive Director at Just City in Memphis. We are a nonprofit criminal justice reform advocacy organization. We've been around for about 5 years. We have a vision of a smaller, fairer, more humane criminal legal system here and across the state of Tennessee. It's really exciting to have our three panelists with us. Professor Demetria Frank, also in Memphis at my alma mater, the University of Memphis School of Law. We've got Kevin Ring, who's the president of FAM, and Alex Vitale, who wrote the book, The End of Policing, as a professor at Brooklyn College. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm going to avoid reading bios. If folks want to learn more about you, you guys are easy to find out about, and I encourage people to do their research and learn about all the work that you guys have done, because I want to save as much time to get to our topic, and we've organized it alliteratively, as you guys know, around pandemic, prosecution, and policing. And so we're going to ask a few questions about those topics. I'm going to start with you, Kevin, and talk about the pandemic. And your organization has done some amazing work at the national level, usually through the lens of families of people who are behind the walls of jails and prisons. And you talk a lot about the impact that sentences and this criminal legal system have on families. And so I want to hear you talk a little bit about some of the things that have been exposed during the last several months of a global pandemic. What have you seen, and what are you guys working on?
Yeah, well, first, let me thank you, Josh, and Just City. I want to thank National Civil Rights Museum for asking me to join, my friend VEDA AJAMU, who's a friend and fellow advocate. It's been a horrifying time for families. The whole country has been gripped by the pandemic, but having a loved one in prison has been, an extreme burden, because they know that there is no social distancing in prison, that the hygiene is not up to par, that the medical care is inadequate always. So all these things that always exist in the prison system are being exacerbated by this pandemic. And again, the biggest thing being that there's no social distancing. So early on, FAM and other groups were saying, either keep people safe or send them home, because unless somebody needs to be there, it's not worth risking their lives because of this pandemic. Most of these people in prison, 95% of people are going to come home someday. They didn't get a death sentence, and yet that is what they risk by being in prison at this time. And so, all of those things exist, but at this time, what families are lacking is information. So they don't know, they see the numbers spiking in the facility, but they may not hear from their loved one. They haven't been able to visit them in 8 months, haven't been able to hug them or hold them because visitation has been closed. They don't sometimes get to talk to them by phone or email because the facility's on lockdown. So they're left to speculate as to what's going on. There's no information coming from the facilities. And when they do hear news, sometimes it's that, ambulances are in and out of the facility. We've had loved ones hear that their spouse is at the hospital on a ventilator. That's the first thing they've heard from the prison facility in months. And so it's just a horrifying situation. And so what we're trying to say is that we need oversight of prisons. We've always needed it. So this is something where there are problems that pre-existed this pandemic that I hope we learn. But one thing that we need to learn is that these prisons are very dark places and not a lot of information gets out. And when you have a situation like this, it makes it extremely hard for families to stay in touch with their loved ones and know that they're taken care of. So we need to make changes. And as I said, prisons have not been well run. They haven't received the accountability and the transparency during the best of times. And in this situation, it's been really, really horrifying.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, it's definitely been our experience here in Shelby County with our jail. I want to ask a real quick follow-up though, Kevin, and ask if you've seen any prison system who's kind of gotten it right, who's struck that balance of protecting families and the people on the inside with that all so important right, really, to be connected, to visit, to stay in communication. Have you seen anyone get that right during this pandemic?
I would like to say something positive and say yes, but there's usually two issues. One is political will and one is sort of mechanisms, right? So to do anything, you have to have the political will to make these changes. And we've seen governors or heard governors from both parties say that they're not going to use the pandemic as an excuse to make changes. Well, it's really an unfortunate attitude and shows how much we otherize people in prison. But the other problem we've seen is that a lot of systems don't have mechanisms to let people out. Now, sure, governors have clemency authority, and they haven't been willing to use that. But things like compassionate release, where this is a program that helps sick and elderly people. These are people who don't need to be in prison under the best of circumstances. They definitely don't need to be in a prison at a time where they're being targeted by a deadly virus. A lot of state systems don't have compassionate release. Now, the federal system actually does have a workable compassionate release program. And so we've seen over 2,000 people get out. We've also seen the federal government use home confinement authority to get people home who don't need to be in prison. A lot of states don't have that mechanisms. And so the people have not been able to get any relief.
Yeah, I was afraid you might say that, but I gave you a chance to be positive. I want to move on to Professor Demetria Frank from again, right here in Memphis. And I forgot to mention, Professor Frank, you've also started an organization called Project MI, which maybe you can talk about a little bit. But I want to ask you a question about prosecuting, the second P in our list, and ask you about, what prosecutors are tasked with is seeking and finding justice. What very often that is reduced to is seeking and finding convictions. And so I want to just give you a pretty broad question and ask, what does responsible prosecution look like? What does a prosecutor's office look like when justice is at the core of what they do instead of conviction?
Thank you, Josh. And I also want to thank National Civil Rights Museum in Just City for having me. I'm really excited to be amongst people who know so much about some really important issues that we're grappling with as a society right now. The first thing I want to kind of mention is just that there has been a change in how we view prosecution. We wouldn't even be asking these questions several years ago. And that's in part just because of the public becoming more aware of the huge role that prosecutors play, the perception beginning to change when we started lifting up voices like Sandra Bland and people like Khalif Bowder, who shouldn't have been in jail in the first place and shouldn't have probably been prosecuted even in the first place. So the perception is beginning to change because compassionate prosecutors are also demonstrating that we can really do better. So to more directly answer your question, Josh, what it looks like is really transformed. We know that every part of our justice system has serious problems, and a lot of them do lie in the area of prosecution. And I'll kind of start with something that dovetails really nicely, I think, off of what Kevin was saying, and that's just the conditions of jails, the conditions of prisons. The threat of incarceration itself is extremely problematic in the pretrial system when people haven't even been convicted of anything. So if we take, for example, low-level crimes such as traffic violations, theft, then we're talking about being detained, in those same conditions with everyone else before anything has been proven. And for very petty and non-threatening, non-violent offenses. And there are enormous expenses to a system that does that at the pretrial phase, especially to taxpayers and individuals. There are also so many collateral consequences relating to incarceration for petty offenses. Sometimes those losses can be just as harsh, if not worse, even in the short term, than those that commit serious crime. So transform looks like certain petty crimes really being taken off the table for arrest and detention. And you know, I think we all have these references now that we can draw from that demonstrates how important this is. If you take, for example, George Floyd, which the conversation really became about police violence, and that is certainly where the conversation needs to be placed. But he was being arrested for passing a $20 counterfeit bill. This should be a summons to court at the most. So in terms of serious crime, and when individuals are incarcerated for serious crime, it's even harder. It's hard to not take a deal, even if it's a bad one, when you're faced with a serious crime. And we have to think about how prosecutors are charging, bringing the conversation back to them, that they overcharge in many situations. They know that incarceration is hard, and they know the odds of individuals taking a plea are in their favor, regardless of guilt. The threat of they are overcharging, and the threat of those harsher, unwarranted penalties often result in false pleas. There are people taking deals just because they're afraid of the possible penalties of severe offenses they've been charged with. Prosecutors also have a lot of discretion in a number of other matters through the criminal process that transform means that we need to look at. When there's high discretion that prosecutors have, when that discretion is available to any party, any decision maker, there's a high potential for bias. No matter how well intended an individual might be, implicit bias impacts all parts of decision making, including the framing of evidence, the decision whether to pursue charges or dismiss on skimpy evidence, what to tell opposing side about evidence. And then when we think about the youth system, this also involves discretion in whether youth are transferred to the adult system or not, which obviously has life-changing consequences. So transform also looks like taking some of that decision-making authority away from prosecutors and making sure that we have the very best prosecutors in place that are willing to admit and confront their biases. And then I'll say quickly that transform also looks like bail reform. There's been a lot of mixed data about bail reform, but then there's also been a lot of positive data coming out of New York and some other places that have tampered with bail reform. For example, in New York, before they began messing with bail reform and making improvements for a more fair system, about 60% of people sitting in jail in New York were there because they could not afford to leave. And they've reduced that number in just a year by about 30%. And so we're learning that there are things that work. There are ways that we can keep people from behind bars in those conditions that Kevin was talking about. And then finally, I think it looks like accountability and compassion. We really are playing with a lot of people's lives here on a system that we know that isn't working. We get into a room and we get on these panels like this one, and we all recognize that there's a big problem, and then the movement is very slow. So transform probably looks like sweeping legislation from the federal government, just like the 1994 crime bill that got us here. So it looks like wraparound services because we're being compassionate. We have to demand great prosecutors, and that's really what's important in prosecution, because we have recidivism really high in places where compassionate prosecutors are not, like Memphis, Shelby County, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to exercise a little bit of moderator's privilege and lift up one point that you made, especially about pretrial detention and bail, and say that, you know, at the Memphis Community Bail Fund, which we run at Just City, we've seen more than 60% of the cases of the people that we've bailed out be dismissed completely. So the power of people being locked up pre-trial is such that when you take it away, which we do at the Memphis Community Bail Fund, more than 60% of the time, the prosecutor, the judge, they look at the case and they refuse to prosecute it, which tells us that this is not a system that is doing what it purports to do. And prosecutors have so much to do with that. Well, thank you, Professor Frank. We'll come back to you. We'll come back to Kevin. I want to move to Alex Vitale, who wrote the book, The End of Policing, and has had a very busy previous 10 months because of that, because of the conversation that we've been having in this country about policing, the reforms that are needed, the difficulty in doing that, whether it's about funding, whether it's not about funding. But I want to ask you a question, Professor Vitale, about sort of the priorities and incentive structures that we see in modern policing and how they mirror how we treated enslaved people, the colonial history in this country and in many places across the world. What are the similarities there, and how show us the thread to today?
200 years of history in 2 minutes. Well,
yes,
thank you. Thank you, Josh, and thanks for having me be a part of this important conversation at such an important place like the National Civil Rights Museum. So, most people imagine, well, we've always had policing, and policing is just this sort of taken for granted institution, but it's actually a fairly recent invention. Most police forces have only been around less than 200 years, in many cases only about 150. But when we look back to those early origins of policing, we see they're rooted in solving certain kinds of problems, mostly for local governments. These are problems of so-called crime and disorder, but that really are rooted in profound systems of inequality and exploitation. And when we look concretely at what drives the creation of local police departments in the US, we see that it's tied to either colonialism, mostly in the West, groups like the Texas Rangers. In the South, slavery. In places like Charleston, where the Charleston City Watch and Guard, I argue, was the first modern police force in the world, created in the 1780s. And in the North, linked to labor strife and managing this huge influx of new immigrant industrial workers, the creation of police forces in Boston and New York, et cetera. And in each of these cases, police are creating not a system of law enforcement as much as they are a system of social order. But that social order is rooted in these deep inequalities, which are almost always racialized. Obviously, in the case of colonialism and slavery, but even in the case of industrialization, where new immigrant groups are often treated as less than white in this early immigrant process, whether they're Italian or Jewish or Irish. Now, today, we don't have colonialism and slavery in this 19th century sense. We barely have industrialization in many parts of the country anymore. What we have is a system of austerity, where jobs have fled the country, government services have been cut, and wealth is being pushed up the economic ladder through direct government involvement. And what this means is that new social problems are being created as a result of this. Things like mass homelessness, failed schools, untreated mental health and substance abuse problems. And then policing is tasked with managing the consequences of those social problems, not solving them, just kind of keeping a lid on them. And if we look at what police actually do day in and day out, they're not chasing bank robbers, they're not finding serial killers, they're managing the lives of very poor people in the most vulnerable and disadvantaged circumstances, whether it's kids who've experienced trauma, lack of housing and food security, whether it's people with mental health crises that don't have access to high quality health care, whether it's families in crisis because their social safety net is eroded. So police are responding to mental health crisis calls, they're chasing homeless people around the block, they're patrolling the hallways of our children's schools, and we need to look at how that facilitates ongoing systems of exploitation and inequality. Politicians are allowed to make their downtown real estate deals, to keep giving tax breaks to the rich. And then when those economic decisions produce these social problems, we turn to the police to bail us out. And that in itself is producing a whole set of additional burdens for these most vulnerable communities.
And is this response to that going after budgets. Is that just where we are because of decades and centuries, as you say, of this, leaning on police officers? Is that, have we just gotten to the bottom, or can we still depend on our systems of democracy to shift some of those dependencies?
Well, I think this rise of the so-called defund the police movement, which is of course an inadequate, framing, what it's signaling is a rejection of our traditional ideas of police reform. This idea that we're going to fix the problems of racial disparities, excessive use of force, abuse of authority, that we're going to fix that by giving police implicit bias training or having them wear body cameras or creating a few more oversight boards. What we've learned over the last 5 or 6 years is that that's not working. The officers in Minneapolis who were responsible for the death of George Floyd had implicit bias training and de-escalation training, and were wearing body cameras and were operating under a new use of force policy, and none of that mattered. It did not save his life. His life just didn't matter in that circumstance. And it was a circumstance where, as DEMETRIA pointed out, the police shouldn't even been involved in the first place. It was a minor issue of a suspected counterfeit bill, that the police power should not have been used in that way. So this new moment we're in is this idea that we need to rethink our political priorities. It's not really about, in a sense, the police. It's about our political leadership that continues to say that 25, 35, 45% of local budgets should go into policing, while there's no money for after-school services, there's no money for mental health treatment services, there's no money for affordable housing. And so this is really a cry for a broad kind of political realignment of priorities.
Sure. Thank you. I so wish we had more time to go into all of these things, but I'm going to give you each one last shot in the few remaining minutes that we have left. This conference is called Journey to Justice, and so I want to give you a chance to respond to this idea that we're obviously not where we used to be. We're headed somewhere in this journey in each of these issues. And so I want to start with you, Professor Frank, and just ask you where you see us. And of course, you can comment about this in the local frame here in Memphis or nationally with prosecutors. As you've already talked a lot about the awareness that's happened and the education that's been going on over the last several years. Where are we? Where do we need to go? Are we going to get there? And we'll wrap up with that question.
Yeah. So I think I said a lot in the first group of my comments. So I'm going to keep it short and focus on one thing that I didn't hit that I really think kind of responds to that question in the most broad way possible, but also I think is really at the heart of the issues. And that's just our overall culture of punitiveness. That is something in order to do any of the changes that Kevin, Alex, or I are suggesting, we have to change how we think about our criminal justice system. We have to change its purpose. We have to understand what it's good for, as Alex mentioned, and what it's not good for. And we cannot do that among a culture of punitiveness. And I'll kind of end on a note, because a lot of my work focuses on intervention in youth and centering youth, in using that as an example. And some of the issues that you and I work together with with Josh personally is we have that same punitive culture when it comes to our young people. We are treating them no differently in the system, even though we're supposed to have an entire system that's different from the adult system. So our culture has become so punitive that we've carried that out in our juvenile system, but also in our schools. Schools literally look like jails and prisons in some places in our country. And we need to take a close and hard look at whether that culture of punitive comports with who we say we are now.
Yeah, thank you. Kevin, with sentencing and with how we treat people who run afoul of our laws, of the societal contract, where are we? And have we made progress? Where do we need to go?
Yeah, I think we're making progress, especially in the area of drugs. We're seeing low-level drug offenses decriminalized because people see this as a public health matter more than, 30 years ago, where it was seen as a moral failing. And I think if you look at just recently, Congress eliminated the ban on people in prison being eligible for Pell Grants, which allow them to pursue education. That was in the 94 crime bill, a really terrible, spiteful aspect of that crime bill. But Congress just repealed that. And that's not going to solve, a million problems. But I think it just shows you that slowly the circle of compassion is growing, and that what we've seen when it comes to civil rights for people of color, for gay people, this idea that people in prison are somehow other or different than us, when the statistics show us that all of us have had either a family member or a friend who's been in prison, that they are not that different, and that but for the grace of God go we. That if we see them as humans who have potential, that we will change the way we treat them. And I think that's slowly growing. We still have a long way to go, but I think we're on the right direction.
Thanks. And Professor Vitale, we'll give you the last word. It's hard for me sitting in Memphis, Tennessee, to believe that we're making progress sometimes in policing. Every Friday at 4:30, it seems like we get another press release about an officer who's not going to be prosecuted. It feels like 7 months ago. It feels like 7 years ago. It feels like 70 years ago. Where are we? And has there been progress? What do we need to see with policing?
Well, I don't think we should put all our eggs in the basket of police accountability per se. I think that the system has created policing to be immune from that kind of oversight. It's not an accident. It's not a failing of the system. That's the way the system was designed. So that's why, in a sense, we have to go over their head. And I think a lot of my work is really more about political accountability than it is police accountability. And what we've seen over the summer, in addition to the protests, are some pretty concrete victories in cities across the country that have decided to start shifting resources into interventions that are going to directly address public safety matters in less punitive and violent ways. They're creating mental health crisis teams. They're expanding community-based mental health services. They're creating new affordable housing options. They're rethinking the use of police in schools and hiring more counselors instead. And this is happening in cities where the conversation has shifted from one of just police accountability to rethinking this issue of justice that both Kevin and DEMETRIA have spoken about. And I think that's so essential right now. We've come to accept this idea that justice equals vengeance, and that we measure accountability in terms of years of imprisonment. And this is such a degraded notion of justice. We need to think about justice in terms of creating healthy, sustainable individuals and communities, of creating a safe and healthy society for ourselves. And just relying on intensive and invasive policing and mass incarceration is not doing that.
Incredible insight, all of you. Thank you so much. Learn more about Professor Frank and Project MI. Use your friend Google to do this. Learn more about Project MI and what Professor Frank's up to. Learn about FAM and the good work that they've done. And Professor Vitale's got a new edition, as I understand, of the book, The End of Policing, coming out soon. Look for that and read that. You guys have been amazing. We really appreciate your time today. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks.
The government will punish anyone who exercises their right to a trial.
This is not a healthy way to administer justice.
If an individual wants to go to trial, they risk a much longer sentence.
But he was adamant that he was going to put his faith in the trials.
And I didn't see how I could lose by going to trial.
I just cried so hard. I just thought, I'm cooked.
There should be no question that the trial penalty affects everyone.
People plead guilty because if they don't, they could lose everything.
Journey Stop 3, Returning Citizens and Transforming Justice. Panelists Marcus Bullock, TOPEKA K. Sam, and Robert SHIPP. Moderated by VEDA AJAMU, Director of Community Engagement and Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Initiatives at the National Civil Rights Museum.
Greetings. Thank you for joining us for Journey Stop 3, Returning Citizens and Transforming Justice. My name is VEDA AJAMU. I am the Director of Community Engagement and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiatives for the National Civil Rights Museum. I am also an advocate for criminal justice reform, which is very personal and important to me, and it pairs well with my role and responsibilities at the museum. How so? Justice was one of the 6 pillars that Dr. King focused on. The others are economics, poverty, education, housing, and peace, which all tie back to injustices and inequalities returning citizens face. I'd like to welcome this great group of panelists that we have lined up to speak on this very important topic, sharing their experiences. I have Marcus Bullock with Flick Shop, TOPEKA Sam with Ladies of Hope Ministries, and Robert SHIPP with the Link Consultant Group. Welcome and thank you for answering my call. So I'd like to get started. I will ask each of you a 2-part question. The first part of the question will speak to the broader problem, and the second question will speak to you personally. I will repeat the question if you like. You just let me know. So the first, let's get started. Let's dive into this. So the first question is for Marcus. But before I go to that question, Marcus, I just want to make a note. Marcus and I became Facebook friends at some point throughout our advocacy for criminal justice reform. And then he posted a TED Talk. And that TED Talk was so powerful because he spoke from the heart, and he spoke about his experiences of being a juvenile, being sent to an adult prison facility. So I'm going to just go ahead and jump into this, and I'm sure Marcus is going to share a little bit of that with us. Marcus, why is connection and community important for incarcerated people? What does disconnection do to those living inside? So would you like me to repeat that for you?
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for the question, Vida. I'm super grateful to be here this afternoon and to join such an incredible panel and have an awesome discussion. One of the things I'm the most passionate about is family connectivity. So I think it's so fitting for you to be able to start this panel off, this conversation off, talking about that exclusively. And just to give some of the listeners some background, I'll talk a little bit more about this in detail later on, but I went to prison when I was a 15-year-old kid for stealing a car from someone in a shopping mall parking lot. And when I went to prison, because of the way that my judge sentenced me, and I had to spend all that time at adult maximum security facilities, it forced me to try to find creative ways to stay connected to my family members well before a lot of the newer technology advancements started to permeate around these correctional facilities throughout the country. And it really landed on my mom writing me letters and sending me photos for the majority of my sentence, and doing it consistently every single day to make sure that I was connected to her and to my family members, my nieces, my nephews, my uncles, the members of my church, my basketball team. She wanted to be able to send me photos of all of these people to help me understand that there was still life after prison. Because one of the things that we quickly learned as a part of my sentence, it was one of the things, sometimes miss is that when one person goes to prison, the entire family goes to prison. But the one thing that we learned very, very swiftly was that, there weren't a lot of people in prison that were getting a lot of mail there, right? Mail being the predominant way that we stay connected to our loved ones that are back in the community. There weren't a lot of us that were getting mail. And when I learned that I was one of the unicorns inside of my housing units that was receiving love from my mom and my sister and and my neighbors and friends, I clearly, I noticed it very clearly, very swiftly, that there was something different here. My mood was different. My aspirations were different. The ambitions that I had to come home and succeed after prison, they were different. And that's when we learned that we had to figure out a way to be able to bring that reality of family connectedness and community connectedness at scale into these facilities, which brought on the creation of Flickshop.
Great, wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And so the second part of it, could you speak just a little more about your Flickshop and how it is important?
Yeah, well, I'll help. Thank you for that question. Well, when my mom started writing me letters and sending me pictures, she was adamant about being the Instagram before there was Instagram, right? My mom would send me photos of the food that she would eat, the pictures of my bedroom from home, the office where she worked, the pen, her favorite pen at her desk. And she would write a long letter about this one isolated thing. And initially, it didn't make sense to me. I was like, why is my mom's a cheeseburger, pizza, and all this? But eventually, I saw that it was creating a bond between her and I that has now continued to be everlasting. And when we wanted to figure out a way to be able to solve that, we ended up building a mobile app that we called Flickshop that allowed for our customers to be able to do the same thing that my mom did for me, which was take a picture, add some quick text, press send, and for 99 cents, we will print that picture and text on a real tangible postcard, and we would ship it to any person, any prison, anywhere in the country. We knew that if we could keep families connected this way, then we could demonstrably show that recidivism would be preventable by family connectivity. Now, so far, we've connected over 170,000 families with our free mobile app. And we're really, really excited about announcing that we've shipped almost 700,000 postcards within every state in this country. That's something to be very, very proud of. I'm excited to see where the future of Flickshop is going to continue to grow.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for that, Marcus. I really appreciate it. So next we're going to go to TOPEKA. I met TOPEKA in 2016 at, I believe it was a home for the holidays, some type of criminal justice reform event. And she and I connected right away. And TOPEKA started sharing how passionate she was about getting women home from prison. And she talked about freely about her own incarceration and how important it was to obtain the freedom and justice for women that she left behind. And I also want to say, TOPEKA, congratulations for your full pardon that you received on last week.
Thank you.
That is so exciting, such exciting news. So TOPEKA, the questions I have for you. What does it mean to rebuild after incarceration? And what ways do you suggest those awaiting release to prepare for life after incarceration?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Vida. I echo Marcus and being incredibly honored and humbled to be on this panel with such brilliance. And I remember the day that we met and you handed me a pin that said "Free Robert SHIPP," and so I'm so happy to see Robert here, actually being on a panel with him. So that's exciting. And yeah, Marcus, congratulations. That is huge. I'm so proud of you and proud of Flickshop and the work that you all are doing. So that's incredible. So, I mean, and thank you. Yes, I'm super excited about this part, and it was so unexpected. I didn't apply. It just happened, but I said that's God's favor. And I'm just grateful for it and to be a recipient of it. And so I would say when we think about like rebuilding our lives after prison or while even in prison, I know it's a two-part question, but it comes together for me. While incarcerated, I remember walking, well, when I got to the federal prison system, because when I was arrested, I was originally put in a county jail in Virginia. And so I was there 11 months prior to me taking a plea and getting sentenced. And when I got to the federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut, I remember walking past the board and there was a letter up there from the then director of the BOP, and it was like, your first day of incarceration is your first day to reentry. And I remember reading that, and I was like, okay, well, what do they mean? What is this word reentry? What does any of this mean? And I remember just asking questions and reading and say, okay, well, let's see what programs they have. And yet they had none, like where we were, it was knitting, crocheting, and plastic canvassing for women as adult continuing education courses. And I was saying, well, how do people expect you to be able to transform your life and have real opportunities with knitting and crocheting, right? And so as I began to just pray and fast and meditate and really understand what it was that God wanted for me to do, my organization was birthed, the Ladies of Hope Ministries, there. And when I came home, before the organization was registered, before anything, I was like, I'm the founder and executive director of the Ladies of Hope Ministries. And I say I was just speaking that on every panel I was on, anywhere I went. And I organized for the first 2 years, meeting other women. That was released in May of 2015. I met you in 2016. And from our conversation, just as a little tidbit, that our work has expanded from not just only helping women who have been incarcerated and formerly incarcerated, but we help all impacted women. So any woman who has been impacted by the criminal legal system, whether it was for themselves or a loved one, because we understand, as I heard Marcus just mention, that when you are incarcerated, your loved ones are incarcerated with you. And so it's important that we are also supporting our sisters that way. So thank you for all of the work and advocacy that you've done to free your brother, because it was you that allowed us to understand that we were actually limiting our scope of work and who we can actually touch and help. And so, yeah. And so now, post-incarceration, I feel like whatever it is that you want to do, I'll just talk about the organization and what it was that I wanted to do. I began to learn the space. And so I did a few fellowships. I did 2 fellowships at Columbia University, was a Soros Justice Fellow, and many other fellowships, inaugural cohort member with Marcus at Unlock Futures. And all those first 2 years, 2 to 3 years, I was really just learning about criminal justice. What does that mean? What does prison reform mean? What are the things while living the experience of post-incarceration under federal supervision? And then just traveling. So I was traveling around the country, meeting people from all over the place, learning what was needed for women and families impacted by incarceration, being guided by other sisters who had been home prior to me, who were doing the work prior to me, learning the history of, slavery into mass incarceration into this country and beyond, learning the traumas and violence that many women face that land them into prison, the mental health issues that people have that land them there, understanding language and not having to differentiate between violence and nonviolence as it relates to crimes, and the way that the system actually tells us we need to look at it that way. And I've learned that when I communicate and speak, that I don't do that, right? Everyone deserves a second chance, irrespective of the worst mistake that may have made in their lives. And we also do know that as it relates to the legal system, that the way the laws are written, they're not written in a way that's actually helpful for anyone, whether it's the person who has committed harm or the person who has received the harm. And so through all of that education, and I think that it's important that people understand that you cannot and you should not just dive into a space without being educated, because the lived experience is not enough. It just isn't. And so from there, it was really just buckling down and finding out, like I said, God told me the things that I needed to do while I was in prison. When the opportunities presented itself for me to start the first house, I did, because that's what I felt moved to do. I'm a God-centered woman, and so I move in that way. And I have just been like kind of nose in the ground and just doing the work. Will I say that it's easy? No. To whom much is given, much is required. Will I say that, we as people of color who are business owners, because that's what we are, whether we are in for-profit or nonprofit, it is difficult. And then to put a conviction on top of that, it's even more difficult. So we're the last ones to receive funding. We're the last ones to receive support. We're the last ones. But when you talked about community, the issue around that also is around the laws. Like, we support each other because we know what each other needs. And you have laws that state that people with convictions can't fraternize with each other, can't be around each other. And people actually get violated and then distanced, and then have to begin to incorporate in the community that they have no idea what that is, because they've left their family in prison, right? You're in prison for decades. This becomes your family. And then wanting to connect with your family and also help with your family, it becomes very, very difficult in trying to transition. And so for me, it has just been really learning from others, implementing the things that I've learned, taking my own business acumen that I've had. I've owned businesses. I've been in corporate America prior to my own incarceration. I went to prison as an adult. So, I was in my 30s. So I had all of that life prior, the much colorfulness of my life that allowed me to understand just how to operate. And that I come from parents who are franchise business owners. So I always was an entrepreneur, raised in that world, and knew what it was to do. And now, as I move and I scale and I grow, I begin to think about ways that I need to show up in order to empower other people to show up that way. And so we often are just told that we should not operate in capacity because we're in nonprofit. We're all, we're supposed to only deem a salary that is less than, a livable wage because we're in nonprofit, and because we're Black and because we're women. And so I try to encourage people that you don't believe the rhetoric. And when you're doing the work and will of God, that God awards us and wants us to have all of the riches and things in our lives. And that starts with being valued for your work, being valued for your stories, and just being valued as a human being. So I'll stop because obviously I'm a talker too. But I want to hear from Robert.
Thank you so much, TOPEKA, for that. I mean, you really covered a lot, and that's exactly what I wanted you to do. And when I was doing my advocacy, I would always use hashtag family serve time too, so people will understand that when your loved one goes to prison, the entire family suffers as well, especially when they are sentenced unjustly and gone for long periods of time. So TOPEKA already, just kind of told you that Robert Shipp is my brother. And and I was definitely going to share that with you. So that's that tidbit of how I started my advocacy. I started advocating for my brother Robert Shipp, for freedom and justice for him. And it was tough. It was a long road to travel. But just as TOPEKA said, I had to learn about the criminal justice system. I had to learn about who was moving and talking about these issues that were important. I had to bring in family members and supporters and childhood friends and just people from everywhere. So I do totally agree that you have to learn the space that you're going to be working in. And some of it just comes by just, as they say, being baptized by fire. It's just jumping in and see what's going on in the midst. Oh, my little brother, Robert Shipp. I'm glad to have you here with me today. This is so important to me. I'm getting a bit emotional because this is a long time coming, and I'll let you share more about your time and the time you spent, excuse me. But the questions I have for you: what makes the stigma of returning citizens so detrimental? That's the first question. The second question: how do most people respond when they know you have a criminal record?
Okay. First, I want to thank you, VEDA, for this opportunity, this great opportunity. I want to thank you for how you advocated for me and brought my case to a national spotlight. At even one point, I was ranked #1 in the country of those most deserving of clemency. And so it was through your work, through your diligence, through your efforts, and hard work and your love for me is the big reason why I'm here today. So I thank you and I appreciate you. You know that you're my guardian angel. I thank my angel Cody as well, my attorney, who filed the motion for me to get the life sentence reduced because, for those who didn't know, at the age of 20, I was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. That was a walking death sentence for me, and I actually did 25 years, 10 months, and 12 days. So that was over a quarter century that I had to do. And like you said, TOPEKA spoke upon in Marcus as well, that y'all did that time with me. Everybody who loved me did that time with me. So at one point, it was more harder for you all than it was for me. But to know that I had that support, to know that I had that foundation, that I knew that I had somebody fighting for me on every level, it kept me going. That was the motivation that I need, and allowed me to do the planning that I needed to do in order to be the person I am today and steady evolving into. I'm grateful to be with TOPEKA. I followed you. Great work, sis. Great work. Congratulations on that pardon. That's big. You know that's big. That's huge right there. And as well as you, Market Reflect Shop. You know, we all know that mail mean everything to us. And many people weren't able to connect with their family. Some people didn't have family. And you know, they send us all over the country. California, you might have been from Chicago, New York, and you all the way in Seattle somewhere. You know, we all know that. So that was a struggle within itself. So coming home, the first thing that happens is that the stigma, the label, we already paid our debt to society, yet we still targeted. Yet, like TOPEKA said, it's hard to get these jobs. People frown upon you. People already pass judgment upon you, just based off your past. But we already, we've done what we need to do, paid our debt to society. And now not only for us, it's critical and it's detrimental, because this is the reason why. Because if we fail, any of us fail, we fail not only ourselves, our family, our advocates, but we fail the people that's deserving of a second chance as well. And they'll be the first to say, look, they failed. They didn't deserve to come home. So it's coming upon us. It's imperative that we do what we need to do, stay the course, because every step that we take, every action, behavior, attitude will really reflect the positive, dignified principle that we all strive to live about. So every decision that I make, I have to make the decision knowing that this can not only affect myself and my loved ones, but other people deserving of a second chance like myself. Because like I said, I was 20 years old. They sent me all over the country. And my blessing was you and my angel Cody. And I was able to come home and start the Link Consulting Group, which allows me to work with various organizations across the country to, you know, share my experience with the youth. So they don't have to go down the path that we went. Even if we see them going down that pathway, I try to tell them, look, it's a different way. You don't want to be in the situation that I was. You don't want to be told when to get up, when to lay down, what to wear every day, what to eat, when to eat, you know. So this is a blessing for me. I'm grateful, very thankful. Man, I'm humbled by this experience. I'm humbled to see this panel. I mean, y'all just don't know. I can't wait to see y'all in person, because I know we have a lot to talk about. But I work with one of the main organizations I work with is Cure Violence Global, whereas we have sites all over, globally, all over. We in Honduras, Jamaica, Nigeria, Africa, New York City, Baltimore, Philly, DC, Charlotte, Atlanta. And what we do is we meet people where they are. We're not judging no one. All we want to do is bring the violence down in our communities. And we target those that we don't call at risk, high risk, meaning like the age from 15 to 25. Those who are quick to maybe want to pull the trigger. And we meet them where they are, and we just let them know, listen, just because you have a conflict, just because you have a dispute, don't mean you have to pick up the gun or you have to pick up the knife. And so being credible and someone that they know about, because credibility is everything in this line of work, and you got to have the type of influence, and being in the federal system for 25 plus years allowed me to meet some people that was credible in these communities. And these are the people I reach out to when I come into these cities, because you have to be welcome to these cities, not being from those cities. So all that played a part. It's like some things that happened to us while we was in prison, we never knew would play a major role in helping us doing the things that we're doing now. That was the blessing within itself. And so, like I said, I'm thankful to be here. And when people, to answer your second question, when people find out that I'm an ex-felon, you know, some meet me with frowns, some with judgment, some, you know, with sorrow, but I don't allow others to dictate my pace, because I know I'm serving a greater purpose, because I'm here. Because like I said, at one point in time, I had a walking death sentence. You know, I had people that wrote me like, I can't believe I'm never going to see you again. Many people told me that, but I never believed that. I never took that to heart, because you know why? When I finally did get the blessing to get my life sentence back, many people ask me, like, how you feel now that you're going home? You know what I tell them, and they mess everybody up, and I tell everybody else. I say, I feel the same. They say, what? How you feel the same? I say, because I always believed one day I was going to go home. The only difference between now and then is back then, I didn't know the exact date. Now I know the date I'm going home. So belief is everything, especially being in the situation that we all was in, and all y'all can relate to that, who was on that struggle and that journey with me. And so, like, again, man, I'm just more honored and a fan than anything, just to be here and to be able to, you know, to speak with you both as well as my sister, you know, because it was a long journey, long, hard fought, and we're here and we made it. And so this has been a blessing. And so everything that I do now is one step in the right direction. Every decision I make, every step that I take is with a purpose, because I believe I have purpose, and I want to reach our youth. That's our foundation, that's our future, and that's what it's about for me. And I'm just grateful.
Thank you so much, Robert. I really appreciate that. Just hearing you talk, I got a little choked up again. I guess I'm gonna have to work on that a little bit, but just you know, actually to listen to you share your story, and it's you know, everything is still so fresh, even though you are free. I have to sometimes tell myself that you are free, because for so long I had to fight for you and visit you in prison. So, so thank you for that. So I want to thank all of you. Thank each of you for sharing your knowledge, your wisdom, your experiences with us to help us understand how society views, treat, and punish returning citizens, as well as the importance and need of transforming justice. Thank all of you for joining us for this much needed conversation. This concludes this panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Brittany K. Barnett is an award-winning attorney and entrepreneur focused on social impact investing. She's dedicated to transforming the criminal justice system and has won freedom for numerous people serving fundamental death sentences for federal drug offenses, including 7 clients who received executive clemency from President Barack Obama. Brittany is founder of several nonprofits and social enterprises, including the Buried Alive Project, Girls Embracing Mothers, 16 Capital Partners, and Melina Rain LLC. She has earned many honors, including being named one of America's most outstanding young lawyers by the American Bar Association. Brittany is also the author of A Knock at Midnight, a story of hope, justice, and freedom, a memoir detailing how her journey transformed her understanding of injustice in the courts, of genius languishing behind bars, and the very definition of freedom itself. Ladies and gentlemen, our Journey to Justice keynote speaker, Brittany K. Barnett.
A defining moment in my life can be attributed to a 7-digit number: 1374671. This number was assigned to my mother by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice when she began serving an 8-year prison sentence. But the significance of this 7-digit number was much more than a prisoner number assigned to my mother. This number showed me a heightened sense of compassion and empathy that I never knew that I had. This number was the gateway to me starting Girls Embracing Mothers, a nonprofit for young girls whose mothers are in prison, to work to empower them and to help them break the cycle that often accompanies incarceration. This 7-digit number was also the gateway for me to become proximate to a group of people who were often taught to stereotype and ignore. People who were in prison, who we often look at as if they're unworthy of any compassion and concern. In 2009, while I was a law student, just shortly after my mother's release, I took critical race theory, a course that analyzed the intersection between race and the law. And in this course, I wrote a paper about the disparity in sentencing between powder cocaine and crack cocaine, and how this disproportionately impacted people of color, in particular Black people. And in my paper, I talked about the legislative history or lack thereof. I talked about statistics. My paper was full of legalese, but it was missing something. It was missing the heartbeats. And so I wanted to write this paper in law school to really humanize this issue of incarceration, to really humanize this issue of this utter failure from the war on drugs that we face in this country. And I included in my paper the case of a woman named Sharonda Jones, a case that would change my life forever. Sharonda Jones was like me, a Black daughter from the rural South, except unlike me, where I was a law student at the prestigious Southern Methodist University's Dedman School of Law, Sharonda Jones was serving her 10th year of a life without parole sentence in federal prison. Her crime? A federal drug offense. Her first ever conviction, felony or otherwise. I couldn't believe when I came across Sharonda's case that she was serving life. You see, there's no parole in the federal system. And so what this sentence meant was that Sharonda Jones was set to die in prison. We have to remember that life without parole is the second most severe penalty permitted by law in America. It screams a person is beyond hope, beyond redemption, and it suffocates mass potential as it buries people alive. I knew that after law school, I was going to go on and practice corporate law. I had a job lined up. I was ready to climb the corporate ladder. But Sharonda Jones's case tugged at my soul. So I sent her a card. I knew from my mama being in prison that it is important that we communicate and send letters and cards and books to people who are incarcerated. And I told Sharonda Jones that I was a law student, that I knew next to nothing about criminal law, but that I was going to get her out of prison. And from there, we formed a very tight bond. I remember on my first visit with Sharonda, and I was driving from Dallas to Fort Worth to see her in Carswell Federal Prison. And I was so overcome with emotion at remembering the first visit with my mom when she was incarcerated. And I drove 2.5 hours to see my mom. And I hadn't touched her or smelled her or hugged her in months while she was at the county jail. And I couldn't wait to get to the prison and have a contact visit with my mama. Only to drive the 2.5 hours to get to the prison, to go through the metal detectors and the pat downs and learn that I could not get a contact visit with my mama. You see, my mom had only been in prison for 30 days. And in Texas, you have to wait 60 days for a contact visit. And so I had to visit my mama through the glass. And anyone with an incarcerated loved one who's visited their loved one through the glass, you know just how deceptive that 3-inch thick plexiglass can be. Even though it seems you're right in front of your loved one, but it seems you might as well be on another planet. And I remember talking to my mom through the phone during that visit and just pressing the receiver so tight up against my face because I did not want to miss a sound of my mama's voice. And I remember my mama pressing her hand against the glass, and I pressed my hand against the glass. Our maternal bond disrupted by this deceiving plexiglass. And I remember while trying to reach my mom's hand through the glass, seeing a tiny set of lip prints to the right, where another child had tried to reach his or her mother before me. And that sight broke me. And so I was driving to the prison to visit Sharonda Jones and thinking of all of this and nervous. I was so nervous. I didn't know what to expect. I had had many visits with my mom in prison. My mom served 2.5 years, but I had never met anyone set to die in prison. And I didn't know how Sharonda's attitude or her demeanor would be. And so I sat in the visitation room and waited for Sharonda to come out. And what I got was a woman whose smile lit up the entire visitation room. What I got was a woman who refused to be defeated. What I got was a woman whose positive attitude was so powerful in the face of adversity that would be unbearable for many people. From there, Sharonda Jones and I linked arms, and we set out on a journey to secure her freedom, to ensure that she would not take her last breath behind prison walls, buried under a life sentence. We went on a very long journey. I graduated from law school. I went to follow my dreams to practice corporate law, working on deals by day, working on Sharonda's case pro bono at night, and really just trying to get people to hear her story, to learn her story of how Sharonda Jones and so many other people were buried alive under these life sentences. And I learned that as I tried to work to get Sharonda Jones free through the court, there was no avenue of relief for her through the judicial system. Our only hope was clemency from President Barack Obama. And so we set out on this journey. And after 6 years, President Barack Obama graciously and generously granted Sharonda Jones mercy. Sharonda Jones had served 16 years and 9 months of her life in federal prison under the dark cloud of dying there. And words cannot begin to touch the joy of that day, of getting that call and learning that Sharonda Jones was going to be free. I will take that with me for the rest of my life. And knowing that Sharonda Jones was free and we had been on this 6-year journey, I was determined to now continue to climb the corporate ladder. I was doing very well in the corporate world. I enjoyed my job. But this call to justice kept coming. And now it's coming in the form of a man named Corey Jacobs. And Corey Jacobs, just like Sharonda Jones, was serving life without parole under these outdated federal drug laws. And just like Sharonda Jones, his only avenue to relief was clemency from President Barack Obama. But unlike Sharonda Jones, we did not have 6 years with Corey Jacobs. And Corey and I developed a relationship. He became like a mentor to me, and he taught me how to meditate. And so as I'm moving billion-dollar deals by day and working on his case at night, he was teaching me this art, this practice of meditation. And I went to visit him. Corey was serving his life sentence in a maximum security prison in Terre Haute, Indiana. In visiting him, he's so full of charisma and character and potential. He talked about his hopes and dreams if he were released. He talked about his childhood and things that he loved. And then we began to talk about meditation. And Corey told me that he had once read that nature could enhance the meditation experience, but he hadn't seen a tree in years. And Corey went on to talk, but I honestly vaguely recall anything else that Corey said during the remainder of our visit, because I could not move past the fact that he had not seen a tree. A tree. I left my visit from Corey Jacobs and I drove to the airport, and I remember taking in the sight of every single tree that I could, from the leaves to the branches to the trunks. You see, Corey Jacobs was at a maximum security prison, and the prison yard was surrounded by a 12-foot concrete wall with no trees. I left that visit with Corey feeling empowered. I wanted to use my platform as a lawyer for the greater good. I wanted Corey Jacobs to be able to see all the trees that he wanted. And so I got back to Dallas, and after much internal reflection, I decided to take a leap of faith and follow my passion to transform this nation's criminal legal system. And with that, I resigned from my corporate law job and began to really dive deep into work for justice for all. It is such a blessing that year, in the 10 months, Corey Jacobs received clemency from President Barack Obama. And to know that Corey Jacobs and Sharonda Jones are free and living life after life makes my heart so happy. But they felt a survivor's remorse, if you will. They knew they had left behind many people who they had served decades in prison with, who they knew were just as deserving of freedom as they were. And so we linked arms and founded the Buried Alive Project, where we worked to free people who were serving life without parole sentences under these outdated federal drug laws. And to be able to do this work in partnership with Corey and Sharonda gives me so much joy. One of our clients is Chris Young. Chris Young was born and raised in Clarksville, Tennessee, and experienced a level of poverty and trauma that no child in America should have to endure. Chris Young was arrested at 22 and ultimately sentenced to spend the rest of his natural life in federal prison for a drug offense. His situation was so heartbreaking. Even the federal judge expressed reluctance from the bench in having to hand down this fundamental death sentence to Chris Young. But the judge's hands were tied. The judge ultimately resigned from the bench and actually works with me now to help to free Chris Young. And as I got to know Chris Young, I learned, just like Corey, just like Sharonda, how brilliant he was. Chris Young had taught himself how to code in prison without a computer. He has remarkable ideas of building out apps that would help prevent people from committing suicide. You see, Chris Young's brother committed suicide when Chris was only 18 and his brother was only 21. And so he has a unique perspective to the issue. But then I was saddened to know that this type of potential, this type of genius was set to be locked away forever. As I began to work on Chris Young's case, I decided to write a book. And I titled that book, A Knock at Midnight, after a Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. sermon. And I decided to write the book to tell our story, to memorialize this journey to justice. Because history shows how tragic it can be when we leave that task of storytelling to others. It is so important that we tell our own stories. And for me, that is why I do this work. Writing the book gave me a chance to really reflect on the journey. And my book, A Knock at Midnight, it goes through this journey of me understanding injustice in the courts, genius languishing behind bars, and really walking through the journey of how the definition of freedom evolved for me. And in my reflection, I realized that freedom is much more than getting people out of prison from beyond those bars. What are we freeing them into? I'm holding this vision now of sustainable liberation. And how do we create liberation for all? Through economic liberation, through equity, through ensuring that we are amplifying the voices of people who have been directly impacted by this nation's criminal legal system. And through this, I truly am hopeful that people are able to have their hearts and minds open, to have stereotypes shattered, to have the paradigm shifted, to really understand the human cost of incarceration and just how important it is that we ensure justice and freedom for all. You know, as I think about my book and how the title of the book, A Knock at Midnight, is so so heartfelt for me. You know, in the sermon, Dr. Martin Luther King tells a parable of a man knocking on his neighbor's door at midnight, seeking 3 loaves of bread. And it's about, as Dr. King intones, having hope, love, and faith. And Dr. King talks about how the weary traveler who's seeking the bread and how the neighbor knocking on the door at midnight for the bread is truly seeking the dawn. And the hope that Dr. King gives us is that the dawn will come. And at a time where I was at a place in my life where I was feeling overwhelmed on this journey to justice, my client, Corey Jacobs, sent me that sermon. And I knew I was going to talk about the sermon in the book and how Corey Jacobs sent it to me at a time that I was at my lowest. But as I listened to the sermon over and over again, I knew that that was the backdrop for our journey. A knock at midnight. We have been knocking and knocking and knocking for freedom for Sharonda Jones, for freedom for Corey Jacobs. We're continuing to knock for freedom for Chris Young and so many other people. The sermon is so powerful to me. Mass incarceration is one of the most pressing civil rights issues of our time. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and many other civil rights leaders paved the way for us to carry this torch towards justice. So long as injustice exists in the world, we have to continue to fight. We owe them to be just as courageous as they were. This journey has taught me so much. And as I said before, the most important part of the journey is understanding how freedom has evolved for me. And I want to remind everyone, as Dr. King intones in A Knock at Midnight, is that we have to keep the faith and that we have to understand that we have to keep knocking. We have to keep knocking and know that the dawn will come. It has to. After all, there is nothing more urgent than freedom.
Hi, I'm Josh Spickler, Executive Director at Just City. When we started Just City 5 years ago, we couldn't have dreamed of co-hosting an event like this with the National Civil Rights Museum. This museum is a cherished member of the Memphis community and a national treasure. It's a vivid and living reminder that the journey to justice is a long one, and more importantly, that it's not complete. If we accomplish nothing else today, I hope we demonstrated how much work remains to be done in the criminal legal system. Money bail, the over-policing of brown and black communities, unfettered prosecutorial discretion, deadly conditions in jails and prisons, families left behind, the lack of opportunity for those who make it home. These are all very complex problems with few simple solutions. But beyond a reminder of how broken things are, I hope we also prove to you that we know what to do. People who've been locked up know what to do. The black and brown bodies and minds that have borne the weight of this carceral system are strong, and they know what to do. The teachers and philosophers and poets who are committed to putting this struggle and its resolution into words, they know what to do. Ta-Nehisi Coates once wrote, "The hammer of criminal justice is the preferred tool of a society that has run out of ideas." He's absolutely right. In our fear, we turn to this broken system far too often and out of habit. But I believe we can change. We know what can work better. I hope you've seen proof of that today. We are not out of ideas. The National Civil Rights Museum and Just City know what to do. The people you've heard from today know what to do. You know what to do. Now let's go do it.
Well, we hope you found the symposium really informative. The panels, our keynote speaker. We hope that it moved you to want to do something. Connect up with an organization that's focused on criminal justice reform. Or even better, make sure that you're contacting those folks who work for you that are now in Washington, D.C. When they do something that you like, make sure you let them know. But when they're not doing what they need to do, make sure you let them know that as well. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope that you will get active and do something around criminal justice reform.